What I would say first and foremost is, and this is true with every family that I've ever worked with, there are moments where interactions between a parent and child, or between parents and their children, go well. And what I always say to parents is, what we're going to do and what's going to be more effective than looking directly at these moments of greatest challenge, where there's the most conflict, explosions, the solution is to spotlight and unpack what happens in moments where there's more connection. What happens in moments when things go better between parent and child. At least in the United States, we have an entire system that's obsessed with problems and that wants to spotlight these moments of intense behavioral explosion or meltdown. And what I've learned is that the solutions actually don't lie in those moments. They lie in what's happening when a parent is actually experiencing a moment of connection or an activity or an interaction that even has a brief moment of more success, more connection, more ease between parent and child. So my work is to help families see those moments, recognize those moments, and build on those moments.
So, Andrew, we talked about discipline some time ago on one of the episodes. It's actually the most watched episode of all, and there's a lot of really nice comments under that episode on YouTube. But there are a couple as well that are less enthusiastic, and I think it might be worth revisiting one of those today. And one of them was about, we were laying down what an ideal relationship would be between a parent and a child that would, really negate the necessity to impose discipline in the traditional way. This person who wrote the comment suggested, well, that's all very well if you sort of do that from the very beginning. If you are lucky enough to have access to this sort of perspective when the child's very young and you can establish that. But what happens if a child is 6 or 10 or 14 and they come to sort of understand these things for the first time, but they've already got to a point where that child is being systematically challenging, or where they're finding that, it seems like the child is, in their understanding, trying to provoke them, and they feel the need to sort of impose their own way of managing the child on the child. How would you suggest that a parent can make a transition towards the sort of relationship we were talking about in the episode on discipline?
Thank you, Guy. I'm very pleased that we have the opportunity to respond to the range of comments that have come in, because this is not about putting out a message that only resonates with the people who agree with us, or who feel like what we're offering is useful. I think it's when people have objections, even, or have disagreements with the or difficulty with what we're presenting, that the learning happens, at least for me. So I'm very pleased that came in, and I want to try to address it as thoughtfully and honestly as possible. I would say first that this is, again, I'm going to speak from my own, as honestly and openly as I can, from my own experience as a professional. I've not had the experience of parenting an autistic or neurodivergent child. I come to this as a professional, having had many years of doing my very best to try to connect with, learn from, and support autistic and neurodivergent children and their families. So that's the perspective that I'm coming from. And I believe one of the things that was most missing from what we presented in the discipline video was this very important question of, how is it that any of us can get to the place where we can actually be calm enough inside, right? How can my own mind, body, nervous system be calm enough, relaxed enough, and present enough with another human being to be able to guide someone, in this case, a child, could be a teenager, could be a 6-year-old, through any kind of moment in life where that person or child is very stressed, very overwhelmed, perhaps very emotionally volatile, angry, right? How do we do that? And it's wonderful to have the perspective that it helps to be calm, it helps to be accepting, it helps to be non-reactive. But how do we do that? How do we get there? And again, that I believe is missing from so many of these conversations, right? I have focused my career on all of these strategies, right? This approach, this perspective that it's important for parents to be able to connect with their children, accept their children, all of these pieces. But that rests on top of the foundation of, in my case, as a professional, being able to be calm and well regulated and at ease with myself so that I can hold space for another human being when that other human being is very potentially distressed and upset and almost in sort of fight or flight mode, right? Where they're either about to flee or fight or any of those things. So, yes.
And not only the child, but the parent also, I guess, having had years of this sort of situation evolving and building up, the parent is also very likely to be in a situation where they are in a heightened state of stress when these situations arrive. So, great question. What's the answer to the question? How do we make that transition?
Yeah. So, from my perspective, the answer is not simple at all, because it involves sort of many different pieces of my relationship to my own thoughts, emotions, my own nervous system, what's happening inside of me, inside of my brain and body, as well as how I show up with another person, right? So what I would say first is, without offering an immediate solution, what I'm going to say first is that every single parent gets this kind of repetitive advice from professionals of use a set of techniques. What parents are not hearing is how can I calm my own nervous system down in a situation where my child is pushing all of my buttons. What I mean by that is that, a child, most of us are wired to react very emotionally, very intuitively, very powerfully, very strongly when another human being, especially who's dependent on us, who we love, who we care for, is in distress, right? So what's important to acknowledge is that this is not just about thinking. I can't just think to myself, be calm, and everything just flows from there. And I think that's the unfortunate, that interpretation of what you and I were offering could have easily been made, that we were just a couple of guys saying, this is easy, no problem, just relax and try and do this and everything will work. And it's much more complex than that.
Well, it's sort of easy if you get it right from the start. If you're sort of implementing this right from when the child is really small. We were very lucky that we had the very good fortune to go and be trained in this sort of stuff when our son had just turned 2 years old, and it made a tremendous difference. Because he was so young, because the patterns were so new, it was much easier to reprogram ourselves than if we and you know, and him reprogramming himself as well as part of that, as if we'd learnt how to do it when he was 5 or 7 or 9 or older. Yeah. So what is the secret? what is the step? I mean, it sounds from what you're saying like there isn't a golden step, but what is the work that a parent needs to do to transition from a relationship where there's mutual tension and mutual provocation going on between parent and child to one where there's trust and respect and just love?
Yes. The first thing I would say, and I believe the first step, is having space and a willingness and an opportunity to begin to learn about one's own, what's happening inside. So for me, that process involves stepping back and learning more about what comes up for me when I'm with a child who's in distress, right? And so I think what happens for so many parents that I'm working with is most parents have not had the opportunity to reflect on that question. What comes up for me when I'm with my child and they're highly distressed? And what happens when people do that is, what we all realize is that we all have many, many years of patterns that we've developed going way back to, certainly to our own childhoods, where we learned in relationship with our own parents how to either regulate our nervous systems and be able to connect and interact with other people in a way that is connecting and calming, right, and soothing and feels good for our nervous systems, or not. Most of us grew up in households where our parents did their very best to try to respond to us in ways that were supportive, that were loving, that were calming, that were regulating. But most of our parents never had that experience themselves with their own parents. So it's very important to acknowledge that most of us are operating in life, doing the best we can, sitting on top of many years of unhealed or unaddressed intergenerational stress and distress and patterns of reactivity. I know in my case, I had 2 parents that loved me, did the very best that they could, but had an enormous amount of intergenerational trauma that they never had the opportunity to look at or address or heal from. So I, in my own life, personally, as well as professionally, in all of my work with children and parents, have had to unpack the impact that had on me, and therefore the impact that had on my ability to be with other human beings, especially when they're struggling. And for me, a lot of it came down to, I never learned how to regulate my own nervous system because my parents were not able to help me regulate my nervous system because they didn't know how to regulate their own nervous system. Yes. So in my early years working with children who were doing things like trying to attack me or bite me or scratch my face, or were in very, very high states of fight or flight mode. They were literally trying to protect themselves and lashing out and stuff. I had no idea how to stay calm in those situations. So what I would do is I would literally try to physically overpower children, because that's all my nervous system knew how to do, because I was protecting myself and protecting them. And fortunately, most of the time, I was bigger and stronger than a lot of the kids I was working with. So I would actually use force. Now, force worked in the short term, right, to actually keep myself and a child safe, physically safe. But what it actually created was a severe rupture in my relationship with that child, where the child was more freaked out, more mistrusting of me, and therefore more emotionally how can I say, fearful in many ways of people in general. So the reason why I say that is because I don't want, it's very important that, like, I want to send a message to all of the parents and professionals potentially listening to us have this conversation, that this is coming from a very deep place of understanding and also real transparency and vulnerability. That I am working on all of these things in my own life and in my own mental health, really learning how to regulate my own nervous system. And it takes work and it takes practice and it takes resource too. The fact that I can even begin to unpack this stuff means that I'm not in survival mode every day, right? I have enough resources, to be able to organize my life in such a way that I can take time to do things like meditate, right? And learn how to calm my nervous system down by using mindfulness practices, for example, right? So I just want to be very authentic, very honest about the fact that there is no technique where I'm going to snap my fingers and all of a sudden I'm going to be calm and a child's going to be calm. And as professionals, I believe we've done parents a great disservice by not being more open and transparent about what it is that allows us to be able to hold space for either children or parents, to be able to help everybody calm down in very stressful situations.
And that's you having the detachment of being a therapist and not being in the family, and it's still really difficult for you. And the example you gave was, it's quite an extreme example of using force against a child who's. But I've seen that happen in much smaller ways when children are much younger, which sort of lays the groundwork for that. I took my son to speech and language therapy, and the therapist had all sorts of props, and of course the children just wanted to reach out and touch those props, and she was just pushing their hands out of the way, almost casually without thinking about it. Small, and I even had a word with her afterwards, but she wasn't open to it because she was just saying, well, what else could I do? They were just reaching out. What else I didn't know anything else to do. But that, that sort of, if they're getting used to that, it's those are sort of almost micro traumas in a way for the child, aren't they? Because they're putting out a willingness to sort of interact in some way, and they're just being very casually brushed aside. But very often parents and therapists are not aware of that. And what you said, you saw me smile at one point when you were talking about meditation. The only reason was because I could just hear some parents watching this going, oh my God, so he wants me to meditate now. He thinks that's the answer to all my problems. But I think, what I'm hearing, what you're saying is that as parents, we can get into a situation very easily of, just being triggered in the same way every time, and you get into these patterns where you're triggering the child is triggering you, and you lose all sight of any sort of other possibilities. It just seems like you're stuck in that situation. And what you're suggesting the way out of it is not something small. It's not an easy trick or technique that somebody could just put into place. You're saying we almost need to go on a journey, and I don't want to make it sound even bigger than it already does, but of personal mastery in a sense, and to be personally aware of our own interactions and our own sort of, as you say, what's going on inside us when a child is behaving in a certain way. What are we reacting to? What is it that's happened to us in the past? Maybe in our past relationship with the child or our past relationships with our parents that caused me to find this situation triggering. And I'm presuming that that's not something that a parent could easily do alone, and they would need some sort of help. First of all, they would need the willingness. There would need to be, I guess, some sort of recognition. When you say what you say, some sort of recognition that this is a path that makes sense and they'd like to go down. And if they would, what sort of help is available? Yeah. Is it the sort of work that you do, or is it, another type of specialist, or is it a mixture of things they'd need to do?
Yeah. So I will say, I will say that I think the first step, right, regardless of the resources, the time, the space, or whatever that any parent has available, is just to be able to consider and be open to the perspective that any parent, as they're getting into these challenging moments with their child, that every parent begin to at least have room to recognize that they're doing the best that they can, and that it's very likely that they themselves inside are getting geared up in such a way that they may not be as helpful to their children as they ideally would like to be, right? So even if you never do therapy, meditation, any of these kinds of things, to begin to perhaps more deeply look at some of these issues and one's, your own history and family history, etc., is just to consider the perspective that there's a good reason why these patterns might be escalating with your child that you may not be immediately aware of, that involve, right, where the solution lies is in you as a parent being able to recognize, oops, I think I'm getting really geared up here. I'm getting really stressed, really overwhelmed, really angry. And the solution lies with me being able to notice that, catch that, and in a way calm myself down, be with myself in a way that allows my child room to begin to calm down with me. The solution is never going to come from expecting your child to change.
Yeah.
And that your child will just, because you say so, just decide to change their behavior. So I just want to say, because the bottom line is, Guy, I'm not a therapist, right? I'm not coming to this as a psychotherapist or as a mental health provider whose career has been about helping people learn how to regulate their own nervous systems and do this kind of deep emotional work. I've been fortunate that I've had the experiences of doing that in my own life, right? In part inspired by my relationships with autistic and neurodivergent children and individuals. I recognized that I had all of this stuff inside of me that was coming up based on my own childhood that I really wanted to and needed to work on. But I think it's important to acknowledge that, again, step one is just being open to the possibility that there's some stuff happening that I might not be aware of, because the work that I do, Guy, with parents is not to do these deep dives into their own childhoods. Yeah. The work I do with parents is really on all of us when we're together, just being able to calm down and slow down and establish connection with our children. That is step one. Nothing is going to be solved or fixed or addressed in a positive way between a parent and child until and unless, in some ways, everybody is able to calm down and slow down and make some kind of connection. Now, sometimes parents have to jump in to create safety physically because the child is harming another child or themselves in a certain way. So sometimes parents have to jump into action without taking time to take a breath to make sure that everyone is safe. And that's always the first starting point. But from there, slowing down, calming down, and connecting is really what is most critical. And so a big part of my work is just being with children and parents in a way that allows all of us, including me, to begin to co-regulate, to slow down, to connect when we're all in the same room together. So I'll pause there.
Yeah. And, this work, this very big work that parents need to do in order to get to that place where they can reflect, where they can, accept whatever's going on in this moment, see what they can learn from it about themselves and about what other alternatives there might be in terms of building a relationship with their child. Is that work you're saying that you think that they can do by themselves, or do you think that's something that would be of great benefit to get some sort of help with from outside? And if so, what sort of person, what sort of professional would they need? Would it be a sort of psychotherapist for them? Would it be a sort of autism specialist to come and work with the family? What would be the best sort of avenue for them to go down?
Yeah, I think that's it's not an easy question, because I would say, and I think you had your own experience with this guy, that the kind of support that would be ideal, unfortunately,
Yeah.
is not available
Yeah.
in most communities, right? You had to leave your own community and go to a very specialized, supportive environment to be able to get the kind of learning experience that you had, and the kind of deep, how can I say, I mean, you walk us through it very, very clearly in your book, Transforming Autism, and I think that paints a very clear picture of how you walked through this kind of experience. But you couldn't call your local, school district or whatever it was and say,
No.
can you provide this kind of help? There are some very, very useful, very powerful resources that I would highly recommend for parents who are trying to think about how to put these pieces together practically in everyday life with their children. And it's one thing to talk about it, and then and I always want to try to offer resources for parents. And also, so that this is very clearly, we're drawing from practice, research, an entire field that's been in existence for the last 50 years, and there's a lot of brilliant professionals that have put out a lot of wisdom that families can benefit greatly from. So I'm going to specifically show resources that are all sitting here on my lap and falling off of my lap. So I'm going to hold them up here. So this, I would highly recommend. It's very recent. It was just put out this year by a psychologist here in California in the States, Mona Delahook, and it's called Brain Body Parenting. So it really provides some incredibly powerful perspective, and then some very specific hands-on, like, how do you do this every day with your kids, advice. So this is the number one resource I would recommend, in part because it's very practical and it's also very recent. And I think it's pretty user-friendly. I would also recommend, this book is a little bit older, but Dan Siegel is a brilliant psychiatrist who really focuses on, and the title of the book, I think, makes this really clear. What we've been talking about, Guy, is that we have to look inside, that we're parenting from the inside out, not just using a bunch of kind of techniques on the surface and systems of rewards to address our kids' behavior. We have to look a little bit deeper. So this is another excellent resource by Dan Siegel, called Parenting from the Inside Out. Especially as children are getting older, right, beyond the early childhood years, and you addressed this earlier, where some of our kids' behaviors can get very, very entrenched, and our kids can have what we call, lots of very explosive behaviors, tantrums, meltdowns, aggression, things like that. So this is a very powerful book by a brilliant psychologist, Ross Green, who's done a lot of work, especially in schools, really helping teachers understand how to involve kids more in coming up with solutions for these very difficult moments in life, and really how to help parents and kids change their relationships with each other. So there's some very deep wisdom in this book as well, especially if your child is older and on the more quote unquote explosive end. And then the last thing, of course, that I will do, Guy, is I will hold up this particular book written by someone who I really enjoy talking with and spending time with.
What would you say then, given that, to a family that might be thinking, or a parent who might be thinking, sounds great, but this is just too much. My life is overwhelming. Mm-hmm. How am I going to sort of, it's just, my life at the moment is just not conducive to,
yes.
A quest of personal development of that sort. What would you
Yes.
say to a parent who was feeling like that, hearing what
Yeah.
we're saying?
Yeah. What I would say first and foremost is, and this is true with every family that I've ever worked with, there are always moments in the day where interactions between a parent and child, or between parents and their children, go well or go better than expected. And what I always say to parents is, what we're going to do and what's going to be more effective than looking directly at these moments of greatest challenge, where there's the most conflict, explosions, the solution ultimately to what's going to help things go better is to spotlight and unpack what happens in moments where there's more connection. What happens in moments when things go better between parent and child? At least in the United States, we have an entire system that's obsessed with problems and that wants to spotlight these moments of intense behavioral explosion or meltdown, and kind of then generate a behavior plan based on those things. And what I've learned is that the solutions actually don't lie in those moments. They lie in what's happening when a parent is actually experiencing a moment of connection, or an activity or an interaction that even has a brief moment of more success, more connection, more ease between parent and child. So my work is to help families see those moments, recognize those moments, and build on those moments. And that doesn't necessarily involve therapy.
Yeah.
Or meditation.
So that makes the work seem lighter. And I think in another way, just putting your focus on those positive moments and having those as the things that you look at and try to learn from, puts you in a better frame of mind anyway, and it gives you that sort of feeling of hope and the feeling that it's okay. Maybe another perspective for parents is that many parents would not have chosen to have an autistic child, and may have had to go through quite a long process to come to terms and accept the fact that their parenting experience hasn't been what they'd envisaged it to be, and in most cases being much more demanding and much more difficult. And this whole process of going inside and going on this personal journey and finding out more about themselves, again, it's not something that they might choose to do. However, they could think of it in the way that it's both an aspect of the life that they've got now and an opportunity to do something that they would never have chosen to do of their own free will, but which can only lead to richness and many benefits on many levels as they go through it. So it's almost being sort of forced with your back against the wall to do something that's in your greater good, and that you would never have found the impetus to do without this little push.
Absolutely, Guy. I think that's absolutely true. And I'll just say that again, a big part of my work is that families, as soon as families in the US begin to open themselves up, and not all families do for many reasons, but as soon as families begin to open themselves up to the possibility that their child has some neurological differences, some has a different brain, perhaps has a different nervous system that is that they're going to need to learn about or get some help to address, right? As soon as that process begins, parents begin very quickly in the United States, especially, to get some very powerful messages from this well-intentioned system that's been designed to help. And those messages are essentially, right, if we can boil them down, and this is not intentional because the systems are well intended, but the message is, you're not enough as a parent. You're not doing very well as a parent. Your child's broken. Essentially, you're broken because you're not handling the situation as ideally you should be. And you need these very specific types of interventions, these very specific types of treatment, and these very, very specific professionals to tell you what to do and to tell you how to do it right. And those messages, I think, are very toxic and very destructive. And parents internalize them very quickly in this process. And what I see all the time is, my job, as I see it at this point, is to remind parents of how freaking amazing and awesome and perfect they are as they are right now. That they are adequately equipped to parent their child well by learning more how to trust themselves. It doesn't mean that they can't get support or can't get information or can't get intervention. But what happens is that parents are not necessarily led to believe that they can lean into their own intuition, their own strength, their own set of capabilities, especially because they're trying really hard already and it's not going so well, right? So a big part of my job is essentially being a mirror where I'm able to reflect back to parents what they're doing that's positive and successful and working, the impact that it's having on their child, and then we can together brainstorm or think about ways that they can strengthen all of those positive and successful moments.